Hello and welcome to the Election Corner on One Man Think Tank. Today I'm bringing you my 2020 Senate election prediction for the fourth week of September, which is the week between September 26th and October 2nd. Now you'll have to forgive me if I have to clear my throat or sniffle a bit during the video. I unfortunately have seasonal allergies right now, which is great when my main mode of communication is audio. Yeah, audio technically, because these are just helpful visuals. So, as you can see, I've already filled out what I view as the safe states. If a state is a pickup for another party, what I've done is I've left it as a likely seat because at the end of the day, you can never know how sharp incumbency bias will be or what it will do. So, Colorado, Arizona, and Alabama remain likely for their parties, despite the fact that these pickups are so secure, in my opinion, you could almost consider them safe. But as long as it's a flip, it's not. A flip from an incumbent, I should clarify. If there was no incumbent running in these races, they would have the potential to be safe. But here you have it. 24, 42 Republican seats and 48 Democratic seats. Already the Democrats are a guaranteed pickup of one seat. However, that does not win you the Senate. They need to win at least 2 more in the presidency or 3 more seats total in order to win. Now, before we dive in fully, I want to talk about 2 states, Kentucky and Mississippi. In the good state of Kentucky, I think over the next week you're going to see some fluctuations in polling if we get out any from this prior week. Due to the fact that you've had the Breonna Taylor case be at least somewhat tried in a court, and it turned out the way everyone kind of expected it would turn out, and now there's a wave of protest running across Kentucky about that. The death of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Mitch McConnell, frankly, giving an interesting series of unexpected series of responses, but done in a very interesting way. And also just general discontent over how coronavirus is being handled and the fact Trump's approval rating has dropped slightly. So you're going to see some polls come out of Kentucky over the next week or two that may very well show the race being a bit more competitive. But don't mistake that as the race being any less safe for Mitch McConnell. Unless, of course, there's either a massive drop for him, or more importantly, a massive spike for his opponent, Amy McGrath. The second is Mississippi. I'm sure if you watch the polls, you've seen a poll that came out, I believe, this last week, that was a Democratic internal that showed Cindy Hyde-Smith, a Republican, polling in the low 20s, and her opponent, Mike Espy, at about not low 20s, low 40s, and her opponent, Mike Espy, right below her, like 2 points below her. That's where I ended up with 20 from, at about 40 points. Now, Mississippi, for lack of a better term, is the Republican Oregon, electorally. You see, Oregon, for the Democrats, has a very low ceiling, so they aren't ever going to really, unless things really change, break about 52 points in that state, but in exchange they have a very high floor of about 48%. This is not to be confused with California, where the Democrats have a very high floor and a high ceiling, or a state such as, frankly, Wisconsin, where the Democrats have a low ceiling and a low floor, but they can still barely win. So Republicans will hover in this small, top-of-the-line bit. So Democrats could win Mississippi. But one, the poll only came out of a Democratic internal poll, so that doesn't, and the Democrat is losing. But also, it showed Mike Espy holding about the percentage he's had this entire time. Well, it just had some bad numbers for Cindy Hyde-Smith, which, as you've heard in my prior videos, and I'll go over again in this one, when the 3 steps to winning as a challenger is first getting your opponent's voters to go to undecided, then getting them to go to you. They have, in none of these polls, been going to Mike Espy. They have basically remained with Cindy Hyde-Smith. As such, I'm not touching Mississippi. I know I'm going to get some comments about this. But that's why. Now to look at the actual polling. Let's put a few more likely states on the board, starting with one or two for the Republican Party. Oh wait, I can't. There are literally no states I can put on the board that are likely Republican right now. That's right, while the Republicans have a lot of surefire safe seats, they don't have any. All of the remaining ones they're defending, they don't poll well in. They have not. None of them are in the likely category. And if you recall from my prior prediction, I actually had two likely states, Texas and Georgia special election. So let's start with those. So the Georgia special election has gone from likely to leans. This comes at one main reason. We're getting some polling showing that Raphael Warnock, the Democrat. So the way the special election works, if you don't know, is it's called a jungle primary. So every candidate from every party is running. So imagine if the presidential primary, you had Trump and Bill Weld debating on stage with the rest of the Democrats, and by the end of it, whoever got the two highest collection of delegates went to the final general election. So that's what's going on here. And for a really long time, it looked like it was going to be two Republicans in the final, which was the incumbent Kelly Loeffler, who was appointed to the seat, and a fellow named Collins. Doug Collins? I can't remember his first name, but Collins. And Raphael Warnock is the Democrat in the race. The key Democrat. There's also another one named Lieberman, and then some minor Democrats and Republicans who are running who take up about 10% of the vote, who could sway things, but it's unlikely they would. But for a really long time, it looked like the two Democrats were going to siphon enough off of each other's votes, while the two Republicans would get low 20s, which takes them onto the head-to-head. It's now looking, we've gone some polling from pollsters who polled early and are now polling now, so we get to see some drift, but also just more polling coming out of the state, saying in a normal to high turnout scenario for the Democrats continue on to the special election against Kelly Loeffler, not Collins. And that's a big thing. If you recall, Loeffler was caught up in the massive scandal earlier this year about insider trading. And given the fact that if it does turn into a Democrat versus Republican race, and the Senate's tied 50-50, you are going to see some of the greatest get-out-to-vote campaigns. Because on the general election day, when everyone else is going out to vote for their senators or for the president, Georgia's just deciding the primary. The actual election will happen a little bit later on. So it could turn into the Georgia special election decides which way the Senate goes. But besides that point, you also have the fact that Loeffler is just a bad candidate in general, and has an entire scandal that has really been glossed over at this point because the Republicans seem to be consolidating behind her. If it goes to a two-party final race as opposed to a one-party, then it's probably going to be Loeffler versus Warnock. And that's a race I don't think Loeffler wants to have. So I'm going to make a comment here. Right now, it leans Republican for the sheer fact of the matter that there's a solid chance the Democrats won't make it to the next round. But if they do, this goes to tilt Republican. So keep that in mind. But as for Texas, Texas has gone from likely to leans. Now, I'm very hesitant about doing this, but I think it's the best choice due to the fact that, frankly, we have seen the incumbent Republican, John Cornyn, losing support. And that's not anything to sneeze at. Well, his opponent Hagar has held support. That's the other thing you need to keep in mind in polling. When the incumbent loses a bunch of polling, but their opponent holds an average, that means your opponent has a high floor. And it just means they haven't gone towards the ceiling. So that puts Texas more in danger. I think I'm going to be changing this back next week, but Cornyn's not breaking 50 anymore. He used to have polls where he was regularly breaking 50 and the like. Now he's in mid 40s while his opponent's low mid 40s. That's not a place you want to be as an incumbent. As such, his position is in a serious amount of danger. So, are there any more Republican states that are leans? Why, I'm glad you asked. There are two more. Kansas. The Kansas race has remained the same. We're getting a lot, it's actually almost identical to the Texas race, where you have, in this case, there's no incumbent, but it's a Republican seat. The Republican incumbent retired, and now there's a fellow named John Marshall running. John Marshall? That's the problem. You learn their last names, and you just kind of attribute a first name, even if it's the wrong first name. So, Marshall is his last name, versus a woman named Barbara Boiler running for the Democratic nomination. She's actually a former Republican, too, which works in her favor. So, she is polling almost, I think the furthest away he's polled from her is about 2 points, and that's put him at mid-40s. So we're talking like 46 to 44. This is a state that, in response to being annoyed with the Republican Party, they voted out a Republican. They voted against a Republican governor. Now, granted, that governor was Chris Kobach, but Marshall's not much better. Not to mention, Boiler does have that, well, I'm a former Republican cred that works well in suburban areas. So while polling is favoring the Republicans, once again, there's a lot of question marks in the air. We don't know how these guys are going to break. Most of the undecideds are going to break. Most of the time, they go to the Republican. But in a high turnout election for the Democrats, or even just a Republicans kind of stay home, or if there's any discrepancy, the seat goes to the Democrats. So, I said that very strangely, but the Democrats. So, danger for them there. Over to Georgia's main election, where it remains likely. Not likely, it leans. You have incumbent Perdue versus challenger Ossoff. Ossoff already has a bunch of name recognition from his run back in 2017, which he failed to win. But Perdue has now tied himself to the sinking Trump boat. And it looks like a majority, and this is key across the country, a majority of Republicans, slim majority, don't want Trump to name they want the next president, or whoever wins in November, to name the next Supreme Court justice. This is going to be very, very bad for Republicans in name recognition, especially since Perdue has come out and said, yeah, I'll support it. That could be the dividing line for enough white Georgians from the suburbs to decide they're going over to Ossoff. This hasn't been reflected in the polling, though. So I need to see some polling coming out showing Georgia being more competitive. Like Ossoff in the lead outside of internals. But also, it's really important. When a candidate's leading in some of their internal polling, that at the very least means they have a constituency that has enough support for them. If they drive it up, they could make the race at the very least competitive or win. And normally I was going to do some more seats before this, but I'll actually cover South Carolina now, because that's the perfect example of what's happening here. You have Jamie Harrison running against Lindsey Graham, the incumbent Republican, who has managed to run basically support Jamie Harrison's campaign against him, which is, just so you know, Lindsey Graham's two-faced and has changed a lot since you first voted for him, and Lindsey Graham basically is running on a campaign of, hey, I've changed a lot since you first voted for me, I've gotten more radical. Which, is a great way to, end up with about 2 or 3 polls now that show them tied. And Harrison's done a really good job. He started off putting out internals that showed him slightly ahead, but a lot of undecideds. And now and they've managed to drive up those communities. So now we're getting that tie situation. And that's a bad place to be as an incumbent. You don't want polls coming out showing you're tied. You still have the advantage. Notice how he's got a slight advantage there. And keep in mind, I don't do toss-ups. Every race can be lean one way or another. So South Carolina is leaning Republican, but if I was a Republican in South Carolina, I won't put your money on Lindsey Graham winning 100% of the time. Or no big bets. Okay, now over to Alaska. Alaska is a leans Republican state. This is due to the polling we have, Sullivan's poor favorables, and honestly, the fact Alaska is historically incredibly unpredictable on this front. They love independence, and they are really against their current Republican governor. They voted in 2018. Now keep in mind, they also voted in a Republican governor in 2018 during a blue wave. So Alaska is confusing, and that's my final comment on that. Now let's put some on the board for the Democrats. North Carolina and Maine are both likely Democratic. This is due to the fact we're now getting a slew of polls showing the Democratic candidates in the high 40s, or if they're in the mid 40s, their opponents in the low 40s. So, like, Cal Cunningham, the Democratic challenger, polls 45. Incumbent, and keep in mind, these are Democrats polling ahead of incumbent Republicans. That's a solid sign the incumbent's going to lose. Like, with no polls showing the incumbent in the lead at all. So, 45 for the Democrat, 40 for the Republican, a 5-point difference with a 3-point margin of error. That is really bad, and as you can see, that does put the Democrats at 50 points. So, the two seats that could decide this are Montana and Iowa. Let's start with Montana, where it is still leans Republican. Noticing a trend? Right now, we're getting a lot of polling out showing Steve Daines, the incumbent senator, Republican senator, is polling decently against soon-to-be former Governor Steve Bullock, who I think had a slew of really good polling for him and is now starting to suffer. I haven't paid much attention to the Montana campaign he's been running, but I'm under the impression he is doing a okay job, but it's not an amazing job. So, for right now, Montana's leans Republican, because even though there's a strong showing in the polls that the Republican candidate is probably going to keep their seat, they are waning a bit, and we don't have a lot of them. So, that's our big factor. And lastly, we have Iowa. Now, on my last prediction, I put Iowa as, I believe, tilt Republican. This time around, Iowa has gone to tilt Democratic. This is for 3 reasons. 1, polls are showing it. Full on, just flat, the polls are showing that in most scenarios except low Democratic turnout or only high Republican turnout, Democrats don't win Iowa. But that means 2/3 of the time they do. And Joni Ernst is no longer leading in new polling. She also tied herself very heavily to the Supreme Court case, making a call very early on about supporting Trump's nominee, which was the wrong call according to the polling. So that was point 2. And point 3, Iowa is getting destroyed by a hurricane. There is mass coronavirus problems. Their biggest state school system is, I believe, refusing to. So they currently aren't in person, and I don't know if the schools are just closed or just not doing in-person classes. But they're refusing to open, and the governor's forcing them to open. And Iowa has basically soured on their governor, who they re-elected in 2018, Kim Reynolds, a Republican who is very easy at some points when just looking at a superficial level to confuse with Joni Ernst. So Ernst might suffer from and Ernst is the incumbent Republican senator, suffer from the rage against Kim Reynolds. So there you have it. Iowa has gone slightly red to slightly blue, giving the Democrats 51 seats and guaranteeing their control of the Senate should they win. And before I finish off, one last note. Montana, Kansas, Texas, Alaska, 2 elections in Georgia and South Carolina. Statistically, I am not saying this is going to happen, but listen to my words here. Statistically, it is unlikely the Republicans will win all of these. It is almost statistically at this point guaranteed they won't win all of them, including Iowa. But we'll cut out Iowa. these are a lot of on-the-edge states. Now, I would say about 51% of the time they probably win them all. But what could easily happen is, just due to how numbers work, how statistics work, how probability works, Republicans will most likely take 6 of these 7 seats. I don't know which one will flip. South Carolina right now is the closest, but it could be a Kansas race or a Montana race, or a Texas or Alaska, or even one of the Georgias. Pay attention to these, and on election day, don't write these states out just because they are a darker shade of red than a tilt state would be. With all that being said, if you liked the video, please leave a like down below and also drop a comment. I love hearing your guys' opinions. If you want to see more from the channel, click the subscribe button and the notification bell. And if you want to hear more from me outside of YouTube, you can find me on Twitter at OneManThinkTan1, the Roman numeral, link down in the description below. But otherwise, and most importantly, have a wonderful day.